Hi, everybody. This is a real honor to be here today with all of you. I am Irit Felsen. I am a clinical psychologist, and I am an adjunct professor at Verkauf Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. I am also a research member at the Yale University Trauma Study Group, and we actually had recently published a book about a study that I did with my dear, recently deceased colleague, Dori Laub, about Holocaust survivors in Israel called Psychoanalysis and Holocaust Testimony, Unwanted Memories of Social Trauma. I will be speaking for 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for Q&A, for interactive Q&A. We will try to do our very best to answer as many questions as we can. You can type in your questions throughout the session at any time, but we will discuss them and respond to them at the end of the session in the last 15 minutes. This is for me a very special and poignant webinar series because my connection with Toby Wise from the palliative hospice and palliative care at MJHS started with a phone call in which she invited me to give a lecture to physicians and other healthcare providers working in the MJHS system about trauma and aging in Holocaust survivors, to educate them better about the interactions between the trauma of the Holocaust and the way that Holocaust survivors experience aging, ailing, and the relationship with their healthcare providers. And during that conversation on the phone with Toby, I received a phone call from my sister in Israel letting me know that my mother fell and broke her hip, and that was the injury from which my mother passed away 10 days later. I was lucky to go to Israel, to be able to go and see my mother, and I returned grief-stricken and devastated by the suffering that she endured at the end of her life, and by the fact that I was not able to ameliorate and get her better palliative care. And so when I came back, I became even more passionate about training professionals in order to improve end-of-life care for Holocaust survivors, and helping the second generation reprocess issues that have to do with our legacy that come up even more poignantly around the death of a parent, and heal and live more fully at this point in our lives. So I understand very well that many of you may have lost an important person, not recently necessarily, not currently, and yet are dealing with some of these issues. So this webinar is definitely not just for those who have very recently experienced a loss. And feel free to share a little bit about who you are and who that person that you lost is in the question box to me. It will be only visible to me and not to each other, not to all of you. And it will help me see who the people are in the audience and what your experiences have been. So I do have to mention that I have no financial disclosures, and I would like to stop for a moment on our two rules. There are only two rules that I feel are very important for the success of our interactions in this webinar. One of them is confidentiality. We ask that people will not discuss the content or the especially if you think that you recognize somebody or know who that person is, that you will not take that elsewhere. And the other one is the maintenance of a non-judgmental attitude towards one another. So if I were to translate it to actual statements that I would like each of you to make to each other is, it would be, I will be respectful of what you hold dear, and I will try to understand what it is that you feel, which is the exact opposite of reactions that we have sometimes when someone expresses a feeling that is very foreign to us, and we say something like, how can you say that? How can you say that? It's the opposite of that. And I hope that that kind of an attitude of really holding, respecting what each other holds dear and trying to understand what the other person feels, even if it's very different from what we feel, will help us to create an atmosphere of safety, an atmosphere where all of us can speak very sincerely about all kinds of feelings that we may have, and feel safe in expressing that. I do want you to understand that as a researcher, as someone who has done a lot of research on the second generation, I can say that there is a great variability in our individual experiences. And that variability, in fact, highlights how powerful the impact of the Holocaust was on all of us, that despite all of these differences, we do share some characteristics, despite all of the differences. But we do have those differences, and those need to be respected. So I want to add a little bit here as to why there might be some difficulties with that tolerance amongst us to the different ways that each of us feels. The philosopher Martin Buber spoke of I and thou. He wrote, in fact, his beautiful short book entitled I and Thou, speaking about the importance of being able to respect the other person's otherness, the way and the places where we are different and separate from each other. And it's an important point for us to emphasize, because parental trauma has been shown in many studies of the recollections of the second generation to interfere with what we call intersubjectivity. What we call intersubjectivity pertains to the capacity to be attuned to the emotional and inner world of the other and negotiate those differences. So survivor parents are seen overall to have been very caring about their children and their children's physical needs, but there seems to have been a pretty common difficulty in the arena of being emotionally attuned to the experience of the child and being able to speak about it and to negotiate differences in that arena. Another reason why we may have difficulties listening to other children of survivors who express feelings that are very foreign to us or to how we feel about our parents or our loss is that we may feel great loyalty, intense loyalty to our parents, to their values, and if someone expresses something that seems to be a little bit different from that or seems to go against it, we may have a very strong emotional reaction. And I ask you to sort of keep that in check and still try to understand the other person's experience. The other, of course, issues that can be involved are simply the intensity of our pain when we talk about our losses. When we are intensely in pain, we tend to be overall less tolerant, and we also didn't necessarily, as I said before, have great modeling or a lot of practice in our relationship with our parents with regards to listening to differences and negotiating them. So all of these factors might contribute to some kind of intolerance to differences, which sometimes makes the discussions among second generation less comfortable and safe than we would like this one to be. So the overview of the future sessions, as you might have seen already in what was put out on the various notices, session 2 will deal with the reality of loss. The third session will be navigating through the pain. The fourth session will be dedicated to resilience and self-care. The fifth will be dedicated to family and interpersonal relationships, and I would like to stop for a minute to add a couple of words about this one, and that is because I see in my clinical work and in research that the trauma of the Holocaust has impacted relationships in the family, not only our relationships with our parents, but also our relationships with our siblings and other people in the family. And these difficulties in sibling relationships and, of course, issues related to the relationship with our parents might have all been exacerbated in the time leading to the loss of the person who passed away, exacerbated and aggravated, and we want to be able to talk a little bit about that specifically. And the last session will be dedicated to how we would like to emulate our parents' resilience, because as second generation, we also inherited a legacy of great resilience and many, many strengths. How did they manage to move forward? How will we manage to move forward while remembering, while respecting and valuing? How do we find a way to stay connected and yet move on and live as fully as we can? These sessions that I created, as you might see, are incorporating a model of mourning, William Worden's model of mourning, and he speaks of the tasks of mourning as opposed to stages, which was a term used by previous models such as Kubler-Ross model of grieving. And I like the tasks better than stages because tasks imply less of a sense of linearity. So although some of the tasks really build on each other and on the completion of other tasks, we still may find ourselves going back and forth between tasks, and there is no linearity between them. In Worden's model, we speak about the first task being accepting the reality of the loss, which is not a trivial first task. Many of us still reach out for the phone. Many of us have a hard time deleting the phone number from our list on our phone. Many aspects that are related to the acceptance of the reality of the loss. The second one is the task of working through the pain and the various changes in one's life that are associated with the loss. The third one, building already on these changes, involves adjusting to an environment and a life in which the person that we lost is missing, is no longer there. And the fourth one is finding enduring and meaningful ways to be and to feel connected with the person that we lost while re-engaging and even restructuring our life after the loss. Kubler-Ross model, which was an older model, spoke of 5 stages, and they included denial, so an inability to yet accept the reality of the loss and various manifestations of it, anger, which definitely is often part of our reaction, and a bargaining phase, bargaining before the loss, which involved, I'll do anything, or I'll do this and that if you only, you know, not die, or if God, please just don't make them die. And bargaining after the loss takes the form of a preoccupation with all kinds of if-onlys and what-ifs. If only I had done this, if only I had done that. Maybe I could have prevented the loss. Maybe I could have prevented the suffering. And I certainly, as I already mentioned, can relate to many of those preoccupations. And that can get us stuck in the past and make it very complicated to move forward. And then she spoke of depression and finally acceptance, or learning to live with the new reality. So if you put the two models next to one another, I'd say that the denial, the anger, and the bargaining in Kubler-Ross's model are very much part of the accepting the reality of the loss and dealing and processing with the pain associated with it. And then the depression is a natural part, a necessary part of accepting, coming to accept the loss and the changes in our lives. And so these two are kind of similar, the depression and the acceptance, to the final steps in Worden's model. So the reason we felt that this webinar is a necessary one is because we know from clinical work with children of survivors and Toby's work with many families here at MJHS who lost a survivor, that the experience of loss for us, second generation, is different than the experience of loss for other people. So we respond differently than people who are not Holocaust related, and we respond differently because of lifelong differences that have to do with being raised by Holocaust survivors. And these lifelong issues have to do with our attitudes towards death, which are very different. Death is not as much a natural part of life for us as it is perhaps for other people. I can tell you that for me, growing up in Rehavia in Jerusalem, which was populated by primarily Holocaust survivors as I was growing up, there were no older people. We did not see natural aging and natural death for a very, very long time growing up, until our own parents began to age and ail. In my surrounding, in my environment, there was one woman, one friend of my parents, whose mother survived because they managed to escape to Siberia. And that woman was Omama, or grandma, for a whole bunch of us, a whole bunch of the children of the friends of this woman, because we had no grandparents. So we did not grow up seeing natural aging and natural death. And we have a very, very different attitude about death. Death came prematurely in our families, catastrophically, sadistically, terribly. Death is very, very frightening and very, very terrible for us. The other thing in which we're very, very different are a whole host of attitudes, lifelong attitudes about our relationship with our parents. Children of survivors in many, many studies all over the world, Israel, Canada, Norwegian, everywhere that we look at the results of studies, children of survivors have a profound obligation, a profound commitment that they have felt from the time they can remember themselves, to not burden their parents with extra worries, to make sure that their parents are okay, to be somehow responsible, a sense of responsibility for their parents or our parents' well-being. Based on the findings in the second generation that show that, many studies, more recent studies, looked at other trauma-exposed populations, populations that were exposed to genocidal traumas and persecution, and found the same mechanism, where the awareness of the extreme suffering and extreme losses of parents creates an inordinate sensitivity in the children for the well-being of their parents. So when parents age and ail and finally die, for the children of survivors, this is a very complicated task to navigate, because we are responsible. We have always been responsible for their well-being. We have always tried to prevent them from suffering further pain. And sometimes in this terrible process, it was not possible for us to prevent pain, to prevent suffering, to prevent all kinds of experiences that were associated with the parent's illness and the parent's process of dying and end-of-life care. And we may be left feeling extremely destabilized by it and extremely sad, angry, guilty. It's a personally destabilizing sense of having failed in a task that was a primary task throughout our lives. This may be an irrational feeling, of course, but it doesn't change the fact that we can have very strong negative feelings about that. So one of the things that that were found to be helpful in the therapy that evolved around all kinds of losses and grieving is writing therapy. So I would suggest that if you can and if you would like, we are all very busy and we are all torn between all the different things we have to do. But it would be very helpful, and you can share it with me again through the question box, and I will read through it. If you wrote a 6-word little story about one of these topics, which I suggest here following the, it's adapted from the suggestions from the website down in the bottom, which you can see, called whatsyourgrief.com. One is a story about your loved one, or a story about the death, or a story about you before he or she died. And other suggestions, as you can see, going down to the 11th one, something you wish people knew about your grief, which is really very, very important to me to know, because many times children of survivors feel that their kind of grief cannot be understood by other people. And I feel that on some level this is a very profound reason for this meeting of ours. We have a different, profound kind of grief that gives rise to a lot of other sadness and sorrow and grief over losses that we have been carrying with us, our parents' losses and our own losses associated with the Holocaust. The people we didn't have in our family, the people we should have had, the people who should have been attending our happy occasions and the weddings of our children and are not there. And all of that is wrapped up, our own grief and our parents' grief and our guilt and our complicated attitude and attitudes around death and around the death of the loved one. All of that is wrapped up around this more recent loss, whenever this might have been, that brought you to participate in this meeting. It is attributed to Ernest Hemingway that he said that he wanted to write a 6-word story, and that if he managed to do that, it would be the best story he ever wrote. And it is attributed to him that he wrote this 6-word story about grief. It goes, baby shoes, for sale, never used. So we can say quite a lot in very few words, and I would greatly encourage you to do so. We are at 5 to 1, and we actually have more time than I thought we would have. So why don't we try to take some of the questions now, and if we have time, then we can speak some more about some of the related issues. Toby, I will give over the mic to you with questions that hopefully came in.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Irit. Thank you, all of those who are participating in this phenomenal opportunity to take advantage not only of Irit's expertise, but of all that we hold based on the relationship and the love of those that we cared for so long. So we actually have comments. We have several comments. I haven't yet seen an actual question, but the comments so far demonstrate appreciation and resonance, that everything you're saying is resonating deeply. One person comments on how her father had an incredible sense of humor. And I'm wondering, Irit, one of the aspects and attributes of many Holocaust survivors and their ability to survive and to move forward was to put in context what was important and what not to sweat, not sweating the small stuff. And how is that type of a comment, how is the sense of humor something that we as second generation or perhaps third generation or even professionals who are working with clients who are Holocaust survivors, how do we learn from that? How do we use that as part of a way to frame our loss and a way to overcome the pain of it?
I think that that's a beautiful comment, and we will probably talk even more about this in the session dedicated to resilience and self-care. As I said already, because I think it's such an important thing that has to be mentioned hand in hand, the resilience of the survivors is a mind-boggling phenomenon. If we had ever had to imagine what would be the outcome of such a 4-year-long, for some people, or 1-year-long, or 1-week-long trauma of the magnitude of the trauma that survivors endured, we would never have been able to predict such resilience, such capacity to rebuild and to move forward and to create such vibrant, proactive, pro-social lives as the survivors did. You know, there is a very large-scale study that was conducted by the World Health Organization. It was published in 2014. The sample was enormous. It included many thousands of people in 20 different countries all across the world. And the study tried to examine the issue of how many traumas can one endure before one gets very impaired. That was essentially, the finding were that in various trauma-exposed populations, people who endured more than 4 events that fulfill the criteria for a trauma in our DSM, in our statistical manual for, what constitutes traumatic events, people who endured more than 4 were significantly more impaired in life than those who endured less. And Holocaust survivors endured more than 4 a day, most of them. So it is really remarkable and the sense of humor, or the sense of knowing not what to sweat, all of these features that really have become recognized as characteristics of what we call post-traumatic growth, which is very positive abilities and capacities that people who have been through terrible traumas sometimes associate with their terrible trauma. It's not to say that people say, oh, I'm glad I went through this terrible trauma, but they do say, having gone through it has shown me such and such has shown me or clarified for me what is most important in life, what is most important to me. My sense of humor was so helpful. My connection with other people was so helpful. So if they come out with a sense of what is really the most important in life, and that is also part of what the second generation inherited. That is also part of our legacy, our parents' resilience, our parents' sense of humor, our parents' post-traumatic growth, and not only our parents' post-traumatic symptoms, which, of course, we all inherited to this degree or other. Some of us were more burdened by it, some of us less. But we all got some of it, and we all got some of our parents' resiliencies. To go back to a sense of humor, I hope I will not offend anybody, but I will tell you that when my father started aging and suffering from some of the, things that happen as one ages, he would say to me in a very, very endearing way, Irush, the person who doesn't want to grow old has only one choice, to hang themselves while young. So there is the sense of humor of that is the way of life, and that is the natural way of life. And if we don't have the terrible bad fortune of terrible things happening, then we have to gracefully age. And that's okay. And that's, in fact, a privilege for people who have seen so many young people not have the privilege of natural death.
Thank you, Irit. More comments have come in, and one specific question I think is very, very important to ask out loud. And I think anyone who's on this discussion will recognize the symbolism. And the question is, have you seen more strife between siblings of survivor children than between other siblings? If yes, why? And before you answer from the psychological and the trauma perspective, I would submit to you that from the end-of-life experience, from the caregiving side of the journey toward the end of life, in families of survivors, we regularly see challenges among the siblings, polarization within the family, and disconnects between what would be considered the parent's best wishes versus the child's best wishes for that parent, or wishes that may or may not be considered best. So I'm very interested in hearing your response.
Yeah, so, when I left Yale University and came to New Jersey, I worked for the Jewish Family Service for a while as a clinical specialist. And I created services for Holocaust survivors there, which were then a new thing. It was relatively quite a while ago. And I created a second-generation group, and I interviewed people who wanted to participate in it. And I remember being struck by the fact that in many of the interviews, people would say to me, I would ask about siblings, and people would say, my sibling I haven't spoken with in 10 years. That's my sibling, that's a whole other story. And they thought that it was very unrelated to the issues we were talking about, which were, their relationship with their parents and them being second generation and all of that. Over the years, I have come to have a great interest in this topic. And in fact, I think just a couple of months ago in July, a paper that I wrote about parental Holocaust trauma and its impact on the relationship between adult siblings was published by the journal called Psychoanalytic Psychology. And for those of you who are interested, it appears, it's accessible through my blog, And there is also a very large document on my blog, on my website, which was the summaries of meetings of a discussion group in Borough Park that took place over a year between 2016 and 17. And one of the summaries there is dedicated to this topic, just in case you want to read some more about it. But to summarize here, I definitely feel that parental trauma impacts not only the relationship with the parents, but absolutely also the relationships between siblings all the way throughout life growing up. And the way that it might impact the sibling relationships I see is in many families it does what you call polarization, Toby, which is a great expression to capture the process. And in many places this polarization manifests itself as two very different styles of adaptation to life, two very different types of relationships with the parents. Often one child is the one who sort of goes out into the world and gets things and succeeds and accomplishes and is the kind of the sort of dictum that they seem to follow in terms of their perception from the relationship with the parents is, I have to go and bring them a lot of naches, I have to go and achieve a lot, I have to achieve everything that they couldn't achieve, I have to achieve for them and for everybody else that was prevented from having a life and achieving. So this is the high achieving second generation, and in order to achieve this way they go out into the world, as I say, and they often follow you know, they go to a further away university, they then follow the best job that they can get, which might be on the other side of this very large country, and so forth. The other sibling in the same family is often very different and has a very different relationship with the parents and stays much closer to the parents, lives geographically closer, has a closer relationship, speaks with them more often, visits them more often, shares with them more of their own lives, and so forth. And often because of that choice of staying closer and staying more involved, oftentimes that also means that that person did not develop their own personal career or in the same way, and that the closeness and the obligations towards the parents take much more of the time and energy, even in terms of their own personal life and their own personal relationships and family. So this person seems to have followed a different perception of the parents' expectations and needs, which go more along the lines of, don't abandon me, I need you, don't leave me alone, you are the most important person in my life, and if you go away and if you leave me, I don't really know what life will be about, for the parents, that is. As a result of these very, very different relationships, the one who goes out and achieves and feels that they should not ever cause any additional worry for the parents and just be the conquering and the high achieving one, they don't share with the parents much, and they are further away. They don't share any of their problems. They only share their successes and the good news and the naches. The one who stays close by, of course, is much more impacted by the complications in the relationships with the parents, and also shares a lot, whether actively or passively. By being closer, the parents know more about what's going on in their lives, they share more. And so the different ways in which these siblings live often causes also a lot of resentments between them. The one who left feels that the one who's close by, who's much more involved with the parents, often also very pragmatically involved, meaning takes them to the doctors and does all those things, but also because they're so much more involved and because they didn't develop necessarily such a career, they sometimes also need financial assistance from the parents, or are involved in the parents' were involved in the parents' business. So they feel that this person who stayed close by is burdening the parents with their problems and is sapping away their strength with all of their sharing of their worries and the dramas in their lives. On the other hand, the one who stayed close by is often privy to the parents' sadness and disappointment at the fact that the sibling who's further away doesn't come enough, doesn't spend enough time when they come, or the parents feel the emotional distance that is created by the fact that that sibling, that high-achieving sibling, does not share much about their personal life or their personal struggles. So the one who stays close by hears a lot of that from the parents and gets very resentful about the hurt that this other sibling is causing them. And they also can feel sometimes the resentment directly, their own resentment, for having been in a way abandoned by the sibling to take care of the parents and to carry an unfair share of the burden of the care for the parents. So these are resentments that can be lifelong and can be sort of under the surface for many, many years, but they can become much more exacerbated and much more intensified when the parents really start becoming ill and age and around the end of the last phase in the parent's life, which forces all siblings usually in all families to re-engage with each other more intensely than they had for a couple of decades. And the differences between them become much more significant. And all of these resentments about, yeah, well, I was here all those years. Yes, well, you burdened them with all of your stuff. And all of these resentments tend to come up. And that can create great pain for everybody. If the parents become aware of it, it's of course a great, great source of sorrow for them that their new family, that their children are not close and not on good terms because family was so important for them. And if it happens after the parents pass away, because often people somehow manage to maintain some kind of a facade for the parents' sake, as long as the parents are still alive, and then after the parents pass away, there's really often an actual cut-off in the relationships, which, in this very large country, can really mean that for the third generation, for the children of survivors, there is again no extended family, because if you live in Colorado and the other one lives in Arizona or in New York and you don't manage to meet, or you don't want to meet, you don't maintain a connection, you don't tend the relationship, then there will be no relationship. And in a very tragic way, that is in a sense a recreation and a reenactment of the rupture in family relationships and family continuity, which I think is actually one of the more wider effects of genocidal trauma.
Irit, your last comment actually piggybacks on a couple of comments that have come in, and wondering if you could speak to these. So somebody writes, I never quite felt the loss of my entire family on both sides until both my parents died. But then follows up the same person and says that recently this same point was brought to her so strongly when there was a family wedding, and it was pointed out that only 8 family members present were from the lineage of this Holocaust survivor family out of hundreds of people at the wedding. And that sense of being alone and being maybe not abandoned, but just being alone in this world Can you comment on that? And then I want to attach it to one other comment from another person who writes that after 3 years went to a hospice grief group, but never felt that they could understand the turmoil and dissonance of this person's grief, and writes, I almost envied their clarity of grief. So the two comments about feeling alone, that sense of continuity, not being there, being alone, and then the sense of clarity in the grief, being able to compartmentalize it, define it, and then walk away from it.
So I will start with the sense of alone, and it reminds me of a very poignant comment that a patient of mine made several years ago. She said both her parents were Holocaust survivors, and she had one brother, and the relationship with that brother was very, very difficult. He was very explosive. He was very difficult. And she did come to family gatherings because she knew how important it was for her parents. And when there would be these explosions and these very difficult conflicts with him, her mother would always push on her to be the one who swallows and absorbs and so forth, which is often the case. The parents sometimes recognize the sibling that is more likely to accept and to make it work, and they push and press upon that person the need to do whatever it takes to maintain a relationship. And that woman had a sick daughter and a lot of issues, and she said to me one time, she said, I can't talk to my brother, and I can't get any help from him. And in a way, she said, I am more alone than they were. And she meant her survivor parents, whose families were decimated. She said, I am in a way more alone. They at least had some cousin or distant cousin or somebody from the town that they collected around themselves and created a semblance of a family, of an extended family. I have only my nuclear family. I have nobody. So I think we have to, in the 2 sessions that I dedicated, one to family relationships and one to resilience and moving forward, you know, these issues that I touched upon today as very major issues for the second generation will come up in these various contexts in different ways. And we will also touch upon the need to somehow figure out, how did our parents, the survivors, manage to do that? How did they manage to create that circle around them of friends and distant relatives and sometimes immediate relatives who survived? And you know, these relationships, I can tell you, and I can think of many examples, were not without conflicts and without issues. They were fraught with all kinds of things as well, but they very rarely led to, not very rarely, but more rarely led to cut-offs in relationships than in the second generation. So what did they do that allowed for that cohesion to be maintained? And how can we do something that, despite conflicts and despite differences, will allow us to maintain some kind of a potential for continuity and a potential for extended family for our children, if not for ourselves with our siblings. So for the cousins, for the third generation, to maintain that possibility and that continuity. The other part, so the aloneness and this, did I miss some part, Toby?
No, I think you got it. It was about the clarity of the grief.
Yes, the clarity of the grief, of course. That's a somewhat different point. which is related to what I said about these issues that we have that are unique to us, children of survivors, that complicate grief. And I agree 100% with the sentiment expressed by the person who wrote us this comment. I think that even if you look at the models of grief, the various elements of it do not specifically address some of the feelings that second generation have. I mean, sure, you can say that it's under anger, but it's not really. We have some particular ambivalent feelings about the burden that was placed on us as the children of trauma survivors, the burden that sometimes interfered with the quality of the relationship with the parents, the burden that sometimes prevented people from following their own choices or choices of spouses or choices of careers because they felt so obligated to their parents, or feelings about siblings and all kinds of feelings about the parents' relationship with the sibling, all kinds of things that are intensified by the presence of trauma in the family, because all children of survivors essentially express that inordinate concern for their parents' well-being. But that paradoxically can actually lead to very, very polarized feelings about each other, as I said, because it's not just that I care about my parent feeling well, it's that the presence of death and horrible things is part of the family atmosphere. And therefore, when my sibling does something that upsets my parents, I often see it in a much more extreme way than someone else might in another family. And therefore, I have often heard terms such as, he's killing them, she's driving them to an early grave. And it's not really said in a metaphorical sense. It's meant literally. The feeling is that the other sibling who causes the parent some worry or pain or disappointment, whether by being too distant or by being too close, is literally killing the parent. And if that's how we feel about the sibling, then it really intensifies resentments. And of course, we will talk a little bit more in the following sessions about the complicated feelings that many children of survivors have had and are left with around the relationship with their own relationship with their parents. And hopefully we will also be able to touch upon how this might express itself or have tendrils or implications for our other relationships, our relationships with spouses, partners, our own children, and how we need to be able to recognize these themes in order to improve relationships in the here and now as part of our ability to respect what we had and move forward to what we have and can have.
So here's a question that maybe you want to put on a back burner for another session, but as in many families, relationships with both parents are not always the same. How to acknowledge and reconcile between loving the parent but not always liking him or her, and the guilt or remorse attached to that.
That is indeed one of those very complicated, complex feelings that I was gently referring to when I said, you know, many people have complicated feelings about their relationship with their parents. We see, again, not only in Holocaust survivor families, although that was the main body of literature, clinical literature and empirical literature about the impact of massive trauma on families. Following that body of knowledge that we accumulated from Holocaust families, we also have by now many studies about families where one of the parents or both parents are veterans who were exposed to combat and have combat-related PTSD, or other families in which one of the parents suffered PTSD. Because it's really not so much the exposure to trauma itself that has the impact in the family as the post-traumatic reactions and the question of how intense they were in this particular parent and in this particular family. But what we see from this entire body of knowledge about the impact of trauma in the family is that parents who suffer from post-traumatic reactions tend to be either more avoidant, meaning more detached, less involved in the aspects of relationships with their children than perhaps would be optimal, and so the child may feel that the parent is not caring enough, is not available enough. The child responds, as children do, by feeling that maybe they are not worthy of more love or more interest, and all kinds of complications. Or parents with post-traumatic reactions may be overreactive. They can be overreactive in ways that are frightening to the child. So children will tell you about having observed directly, adult children of survivors will tell you about having directly observed moments where it was very scary to see the parent's reaction. And if you watch the movie Because of That War, which was in the 90s, created in Israel, a documentary, you will see examples of such, frightening incidents. Or they can respond in very frightened way, over worried, over panicked about things that seem so disproportionate to the child. All of these things can create, and by the way, there can be a mixture of all of the above: detachment, numbness, sort of a child comes with a very happy piece of news and the parent just isn't excited enough about it. All kinds of disappointments and hurts that can be all there. The detachment, the explosiveness, the reactive response to being overly worried. All of this can have a very upsetting impact on the relationship with the child and leave the child with difficult and complex emotions about this parent. And of course, when the parent passes away, that stays with the child. And the purpose of this meeting of ours over the next 6 meetings will be to be able to talk about that and to find a place for it, to find a place where all of that can be expressed amongst people who can actually understand that extra other level of it for children of trauma survivors.
Thank you very much for that, Irit. We are now at 1:28, and I think we have to summarize and close. And I just want to invite everyone who's on to share these groups, these sessions with colleagues and friends, family members. The next session will be held on October 22nd, again from 12:30 to 1:30. The topic is the reality of loss. And for those who cannot join online, the sessions are being recorded, and you should still register for the session. And by the end of the day after the session, you'll be able to log in or dial in for the recording. Irit, do you want to give any closing comments?
I just wanted to remind people that if you would like to share with me a little bit of information about who you are and who the person that you lost or anticipate losing is, that would be great, through the question box. It will be only visible to me. And also the 6-word story, whichever one you choose to write. That would be also very much appreciated. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here with me. It is a great honor, and I appreciate your time. Thank you, and see you again on the 28th.